Hi, good afternoon. I am delighted to be here at the Extreme Hangout in the Green Zone at COP29 to bring to you a topic of extreme importance about urban resilience and how cities can rise to emerging ecological challenges. I am delighted to be joined today by two incredible speakers. In a moment, we'll invite Sheela Patel onto the stage and also Lewis Akenji, excuse me. So our first, Sheela is here. I can first do a quick introduction to Sheela, if you would like me to. Sheela is the director of the Society for the Promotion of Area Resource Centres, a non-governmental organisation that she founded in 1984. It works in alliance with the National Slum Dwellers Federation and Mahila Milan and is active in several cities across India. She's widely recognised for seeking urgent attention to the issues of urban poverty, housing, infrastructure by governments, international agencies and other organisations. So welcome, Sheela, an icon of COP29.
So we're seeing something happening here at the COP. National governments are just failing to recognize the agency of the problem right now and to rise up to it. What this translates into is that more and more responsibility is going to go down to cities, to municipal authorities. Not only in terms of governance, but because this is also where there's the population concentration, and we're going to see that trend even more. And this is where a lot of the investment is happening in terms of infrastructure. It's the reason why cities are so crucial, because they bring together the social, the environmental, the political, and they become a hotbed of all the problems that we see happening at a global scale. They get replicated there, intensified, and spat out in even worse ways that replicate across the globe. What cities also are concentrations of people, of love, of art, of beauty, of aspirations. We tend to forget that part quite often when we design cities. So a part of what I want to do is to go back really to the essence of what it means for a huge concentration of persons with shared or sometimes not even shared aspirations that live together and are trying to create an environment that allows for them to live well and support each other in meeting their dreams and aspirations. And I've gone back to a few things that I think are quite elemental in connecting not only the environmental, in addressing not only the environmental problems, but also the social problems, because I think at the heart of this, we're not going to be able to solve the climate crisis if we do not address issues of inequality, if we do not address issues of racism, if we do not address all the social tensions that are sort of baked in our society and that are getting emphasized in cities again and again. So there are 5 points here that I've just put out. I have just one slide. You're gonna have to bear with me through this. And these 5 points they need to work together to support each other for us to realize the kind of cities that can actually meet and support us in a way that we live equitably and sustainably. My key word here is not even just environment. There's a broader systems view at play here. The first one is going back to really rethink zoning. We've inherited a sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century zoning approach that really was prioritizing people working during the Industrial Revolution and sort of trying to optimize productivity. But we need to start shifting that to thinking, how do we revise building codes? How do we look at workplaces, build our cities in a way that you don't have to drive extensive or commute very extensively to go to work, but there's live workplace zones that allow intergenerational mixing, that allows different backgrounds to talk to each other. That doesn't necessarily always separate work from everyday living. How do you make cities that allow you to get this work-life balance as well? The second one is, instead of individualizing opportunities in cities all the time, we should create public luxury. A typical example of this is the car culture, but I'll talk about that one a little bit. I might as well talk about it now. We're building cities around cars instead of around people. If we started moving away from the car culture, what that really does is it takes away the space and the resources that we're dedicating to cars, to roads, to parking places, and it starts creating richer public environments. If we shift into public transportation that is more reliable, that is clean, that is effective, we'll get much more people having opportunities than very few individuals that can afford cars, and that can afford cars that are wrecking the environment. The third one is to adopt a universality approach. So you've heard of universal health care. So if you're lucky enough to be in one of the wealthier countries, or if you're unfortunate enough to have an American government, I don't know what to say, you know that universal healthcare works for lots of reasons. It reduces the cost overall. It makes sure that everyone has at least access. And it also per capita ends up being substantially more efficient. But we've not taken those lessons to other areas that are quite fundamental to our everyday living. So if we agree that food is fundamental, if we agree that shelter is fundamental, there's no point in trying to make profits off of those things. It does not mean you can't trade in the market. It just means that we need some kind of decommodification of certain parts that are quite elemental to our everyday living. The next one is to build a social floor. Of course, we recognize the need to reduce overconsumption and to reduce the impact of the wealthy, but we must also recognize the really challenging situation in which most of the world is, that they're really at the bottom where they can fall below a certain level where their well-being needs are. So it's quite important to create a sense of safety and security, to create a social floor in making sure that as we're addressing overconsumption, we do not shift the burden to those that are already vulnerable. This, I think, is one of the biggest issues around here, that there's a failure, especially from rich countries, to recognize just how precarious it is in so many countries around the world, and why there's a question of legitimacy around a lot of the points that are being negotiated here, and developing countries refusing to accept the terms. The last but not the least, we focus too much on profit and growing the cities and monuments that show how rich and wealthy we are. We really ought to start focusing on how well we're doing, or how these infrastructural systems are supporting us to live with each other, to live well. So in this regard, we need to start measuring not only our well-being, but to see how measures that are being taken by municipal authorities are reducing social tensions. These are just 5 points that I thought I should put out. They go beyond just the environmental aspects, but there we go.
Okay, thank you very much.
So in many ways, we really represent the global and the absolutely local perspective of the same things. And so it would be interesting at some point to get those slides back and look at it from the point of view of those who live informally in cities, and what happens to each one of them at the present, and use our discussions to project what's going to happen in the future, which is very important, because despite all the so-called celebrations of putting an ugly face of mine on the impact makers, which I don't recognize, I think that the whole volume of people stuck in informality are just not being considered in a serious way in these discussions.
Yeah. So could you tell us a little bit about the Roof Over Our Heads campaign?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. As you know, I've started this kind of work with informal settlements and communities and women's collectives for now over 40 years. Yep. You can calculate my age. Oh, sorry. I always have a deep commitment to start at the locations where the most vulnerable communities live, work, and survive. And 40 years ago, I started working with people and women who were recent migrants who were squatting on the pavements of Mumbai, the city where I live and work, which began an amazing movement which went wild and beyond my imagination, where it became a global process in which poor neighborhoods and their networks aggregated data about themselves and made representations to local, national, and global institutions to address the challenge of informality. Yet during the COVID period, I realized that for every one person we helped get secure tenure and basic amenities, there were about 10,000 households who were not going to get it for another 3 generations. And therefore, while the numbers seem exciting and beyond our imagination, they were just a drop in the informal ocean of the amazing inequity in which and invisibility in which poor households lived not only in India but all over the global south. And so during the period of COVID, I began a sort of a web-based discussion with women from India and 17 other countries to look at what were the challenges they were facing in COVID. So we began with are vaccinations good or not? Is this business of WHO telling you to wash your hands every hour possible in a slum where you basically don't get enough drinking water? And so on. And we started like that. But very soon it came out inadvertently to the challenges that were exacerbated during COVID, which was one of dealing with extreme weather. And they began to get me into an awareness of how vulnerable they were to extreme heat, cyclonic winds, and torrential rains. And now, of course, we are all talking about extreme weather, but that time it was still a new concept. So we began to look at this whole process, and they gave it an acronym, which is ROO, which is roof over our heads. They said, we no longer can trust that we will have a roof over our heads when we get up in the morning, because we don't know whether it'll fly away with the wind, or it'll make us into an oven because of the heat, or whether it'll make us into a flooded household with all the leaky roofs. And along with that came the other things which you talked about, which is health, nutrition, transport. You don't have transport, and disasters. These were the things that women said had been escalated to such extreme situations for them that most of them only had white carbs for food, because that's all they could afford. They spent 70% of their income on transport so that they could get 30%, which they would buy white carbs. The incidence of chronic diseases had exponentially increased. And they were really pissed off when everybody came to them with, with a soup kitchen when they were facing a disaster, never recognizing them as the first responders who were looking after everybody. But they had to deal with the indignity of standing in a queue with a, like they said, with a bloody bowl to get one whatever, helping of whatever. And so all these things sharpened and deepened the additional stress that climate brought into their lives, which were already distorted with the inability of colonially entrenched planning systems that you talk about. You know, so when we worked in Slum Dwellers International, we saw that all the British colonies, if you take the constitution of the city of Mumbai, it's Manchester in 1988. And we still have that. So Mumbai and Karachi had those. You go to Senegal, it was like supposed to be like Paris. So depending on which country colonized you, they dumped their planning, which then through development assistance, all our planners went to that country, learned that, and made that the standard. So even today, it's very difficult to get our planners to say that you need to develop a new locally viable institutional planning instrument that works for the people who live there. And now we're going to face an additional problem, because most of the people who are in this conference will tell you that we are not going to reach 1.5 in 2030. It's going to go way beyond. And all the people who are going to be destroyed, their lands, their agriculture practices, are going to come into cities. So the burden of informality is going to double. Not because only that more people come, but they're going to densify already existing locations. And that is going to produce a whole lot of other challenges that we can't even imagine at the moment.
Of course. But I mean,
So
thank you.
So I'm just saying this is the background for a general thing. And so ROO in a short way, is our attempt to get women's collective in the most vulnerable neighborhoods to be able to analyze and assess the resilience quotient of their homes and work with technical people. My colleague Nihar is here, who heads the technical team. And together they put the detailed benchmark of the existing design, materials, cost, and history of the house to produce a global database in 100 learning labs across 20 countries to demonstrate what is similar and what is distinctly different in informal settlements around the world, and how solutions have to be locally viable, so that some smart person sitting somewhere in the north doesn't produce a cookie cutter approach that has to work with all these people.
Yeah.
And I think at the last forum when we were all together, there was a big discussion about what to do with inter-country migrants who are going to come. Because in India, we know that if Bangladesh, half of Bangladesh goes underwater, it's not, you don't need big research to say they're all going to come to India, and where are they going to go?
Yeah.
So we're not thinking about those things, or at least we're not publicly thinking about those things. But those issues are not done.
Thank you. You can keep that.
Okay.
Thank you so much for bringing attention to such an important issue. Since Roof Over Our Heads was launched, I think it was at COP27, right?
Yes.
In Sharm el-Sheikh. And bringing the attention especially to COP and to those of us who can play a role in helping to address some of those challenges. As you mentioned, it affects everybody's lives, and it's causing some extremely deep social issues that we need to be addressing. Can I ask you if either since Roof Over Our Head was launched or before, if some of those measures that you've mentioned within the planning systems, or any projects that you've seen with renovations, that you've seen some measures being implemented that are bringing some hope and some improvements to that situation? Not yet.
No golden. There's no golden outcome of anything.
Sure.
What we have is a very meticulously developed documentation of the existing benchmarking of housing that people have, and a deep recognition within the network of amazing partners that we have of the need for expanding the options locally for these households. And we are now, so we've standardized that. We've already started working in another 10 countries, which are shaking many of our assumptions, as they should, because nothing is the same everywhere. And it's also making a lot of people who give us money very uncomfortable, because we are not being very efficient. So many times, like it took us 3 bookings and cancellations before we could go to Nairobi. Because every time we were going there were floods, there were riots, there was something or the other. You can't go there in the middle of that and try and do this exercise.
Of course.
So I think the thing is that we have developed a methodology. There is a recognition of the need for attention amongst researchers and amongst an expanding network of private, public sector, NGO communities to explore this. And within the COP, for the first time on the 21st, there's going to be a whole session on informality.
Fantastic. Well,
so
again,
that's just the beginning for us.
And what about the Roof Over Our Heads challenge from university students? You asked them to think about what solutions might be. I know those are being announced at COP, so you might not be able to share with us everything, but are you seeing things
that's, you see, one of the biggest learning we had from Latin America is the amazing potential of ongoing relationships between academic institutions and communities.
Yes.
And how they work for both ends.
Yes.
And so now in any city we work, we make sure that the local universities of engineering, architecture, planning, and social sciences works with us. We're talking to associations at national and regional levels to start taking our books seriously and get them included in their curriculum.
Yeah.
So those kind of things are beginning now.
Absolutely. I am a former architecture student myself.
Former.
Former, yeah. Well, I think when I was at architecture school, these things were not discussed, right? There was a 1 hour module a week about environmental design. I absolutely latched onto that 1 hour a week. I don't think I missed a class. And that's what I built my entire career off. And you know, I've been working in the built environment myself for my whole career, and it is an enormous shift that we need to be seeing within right across the full built environment, right? You're raising awareness of an extremely important problem, but even the buildings that are being built today, we're still not getting it right? So we need to shift the way that we're building, using, constructing all of our buildings, and it's a sector that's very fragmented, you know, and it's quite resistant to change. And we need to be changing the minds of how people have done it before for all of their careers. And I have enormous hope from academic institutions, because the architecture schools, the engineering schools, and the curriculums that are coming through will mean that the architects and engineers of the future are being taught this from the beginning, and they will know no different. And it's already showing that there are some incredible innovations of some of the student competitions that I've been involved with, who are really digging deep into this issue, and they will question, why should we connect a new building to gas? Why are we allowing people to live in this situation without protection to the, we should be discussing heats with Lewis as well. You know, if these, the people that are living in informal settlements will be forced to move to cities, that is where we will be experiencing the biggest increase in, you know, days over 35 degrees under an even 1.5 degree scenario, and let alone when we unfortunately surpass that. So perhaps we can talk a little bit specifically to the heat challenge. And I know, Lewis, this is dear to your heart. I think Lewis said, I don't think we mentioned Executive Director of Hot and Cool Institute. So it's part of what you're focusing on.
Correct. I'm going to go back to what you talked about, architecture schools. Mm-hmm. We have a foundational problem here, assumptions that are brought into our understanding of urban spaces, of design, of architecture. And a lot of this, we have systems that were very useful and were highly needed around the 18th and the 19th century. Yeah. We've carried on assumptions of those late in 2 centuries later, and we've refused to revise those. Yeah. The reason we've refused to revise this is because so much momentum has rolled in, has been sort of amassed after the economic system that succeeded off the back of these assumptions, that we don't touch it anymore. But I do think if we are to move the needle here in any way, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of wonderful ideas coming from left, right, and center, but the institutional mechanism that filters these ideas just squeezes the life out of them before they see daylight or before they change people's lives. And I say this because my favorite word these days is institutional stickiness, where organizations fight to survive, not because they're useful anymore, but just because they want to have space for themselves and play in the arena. And we're seeing it happening here at the COP. So I'm going to now try to answer your question. We take a consumption-based approach to this problem. Yep. Because I would like to contrast that slightly to what we have here at the IPCC, where you look at territorial emissions. So what you do is, if you look at emissions happening in Germany, where I live, you don't include within those all the stuff that is made in China and emissions there that I consume in Germany. So I've burden shifted. Yep. And what this does is a very perverse system, which holds Cameroon, China, India, Venezuela constantly producing for these other people without the possibility to itself get out of that model. We're seeing this holding back negotiations here. When you translate this to consumption, and you take a consumption-based approach, what it does is it tells you very concretely what is the size of a building someone is living in, how much energy do they use, what material is built on it, what per capita. And if you suddenly contrast my energy consumption, the size of my apartment, the parking space that I occupy, and so on, compared to Sheela. Sheela probably has the equivalence from an environmental perspective of half my kitchen. Yeah. As perverse as that sounds, this is the reality, right? If you're looking at it from the environmental, but if you translate it into a social perspective, of course, there's this tensions about the slum that, for example, the slums and the women that Sheela is so eloquent about. But we cannot keep talking about climate change without looking at the practical social reality of people and how they live it. A failure to translate that understanding into design of policy and interventions will constantly keep us at loggerheads, the way we're seeing happening right now in the blue zone. Yeah. So a very long way to say, if we're going to think about cities of the future, we need to take a needs-based perspective to ask a very basic question. What are the fundamental needs for people's well-being? What are arrangements or planning or structures that allow for equity and more meaningful social engagement? And what are the biophysical limits with which we can exploit the environment or use the carbon budget to meet those aspirations? And we look at equity not only within the city, we look at equity carefully enough to understand that we cannot go to Zimbabwe or Mozambique and tell capital cities that tomorrow you will look like New York. It's not possible. First, they don't even want to look like New York. Second, they should not look like New York. Yeah. Because there are different people, there are different needs there are different sets of aspirations, there are different cultures there. This McDonaldization of cities is quite problematic.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's why I was asking the question about, if you've come across things that you think are working well, because, even from a built environment policy perspective, cities that are next door to each other within the same state of the US, for example, that have a very similar context in terms of climate, very similar issues, will have a completely different carpet, let's call it, of buildings. The way that they're built, how they were built, and what it is that they're dealing with. The policy mechanisms that are introduced to address those are completely different within cities that are very similar in terms of the environmental challenges they're facing. And some of the non-regulatory measures that are very effective can be rolled out across other cities, and cities do a lot to learn from each other. But some of the policies are consulted on, right, by the public, and that's why you'll have two cities next to each other that have completely different policy frameworks, and that's quite difficult for the sector to navigate. Again, back to this question about heat, I think we're expecting at 1.5 degrees of warming, 67 cities will experience 150 or more days a year the temperatures that exceed 35 degrees. And we know how uncomfortable that is. That's 5 months of the year. We're getting to half the year. But at under 3 degrees of warming, Sheela, it rises to 197 cities. And more than half of those are located in India. Again, this is an enormous issue, and one that is just going to keep getting worse unless we do something drastic and radical to address it, right? And excuse the connection here, but it makes me think of malaria and what we needed to do to bring mosquito nets to communities that were so affected by malaria and were so affected by such a massive health issue, even COVID, right? Such a massive health risk to society. Government was mobilized very quickly, and we suddenly had masks for everyone. I'm really curious to know if you think, in the context of the heat that these cities are going to be expecting, the challenge particularly around informal settlements, but actually it will affect all housing, all buildings, and especially some of the public spaces that we want to be increasing to enhance social value, right? We need shade, okay? So how is there anything that you feel could be the equivalent to mosquito nets for malaria to help address some of these issues that we can just roll out rapidly and help improve as many lives as possible in a very quick time frame?
This is a very northern perspective, I'm sorry to say, that you have a single bullet, silver bullet. You think mosquito nets have sorted the problems. They have not. They just look sexy. They are not the solution. The solution really lies in not having stagnant water
Yep.
and garbage.
Yes, indeed.
If you can sort this out, you don't have all the places where mosquitoes breed. But you don't deal with the fundamental problem. You bring in these dipped thingies that you think people will use all the time, and then you go and measure only what you can see. And I think that's part of the problem of what I call cookie cutter approaches that come from the north. The fundamental problems are not solved. Like the planning institutional arrangement is not sorted out. The way to produce minimum equity is never sorted out in cities because we are all aspiring to be the New Yorks and the whatever, the northern cities. Our leaders go there. For many years, all our Indian ministers used to go and say, I want to be like Shanghai, I want to be like Singapore. Singapore planners come to India. My city of Mumbai is larger than the whole of Singapore. What planning is he going to teach us?
Sure.
But that's the problem of today's world. That in our, a city-state cannot produce a planning instrument for a country.
No.
But that's what's happening even as we speak.
Absolutely.
So I feel that we're all caught up in a mindset of I want to be that, I want to be this. Without, and very clearly, I mean, we don't have to keep referring to the Oxfam data, which is that 15% globally, nationally, locally, own 75% of assets in every area. You see that in Mumbai, you see that everywhere. Therefore, the city is designed for their consumption. And therefore, all these issues have deep political underpinnings and have serious detriments to all the very aspirational equity challenges that we talk about. And I don't mean to be pessimistic, because when I go to communities, they are never pessimistic. They're always aspirational. So you get an injection of aspirations and possibilities. But the reality is that that's what we are confronting.
Well, indeed. And this is why I'm asking you the question, because I work for a venture capital firm. We invest in startups with the most exceptional founders, entrepreneurs that have identified what some of those solutions are. And we need to be directing investment into what are the solutions that can help? Because as we know, changing those planning regulations and policy mechanisms, it takes a long time. The policy process just takes far too long for even the buildings in developed markets where we really should be building buildings much better, and we're simply not. I'd love to know if you have an idea, knowing that policies need to vary, of course, to local context. If you have an idea of something that could help from that local perspective, but we need the combination of both, right? We need those planning policies that are localized. We need local solutions. And then when we find solutions that really do help, we need to be scaling up to help as many people as possible.
Yeah, but I think the kind of innovations that are needed today are very different from the innovations we needed 10 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
And most of them have to deal with the whole crisis of whether they fall into the private domain or the public domain.
Mm-hmm.
So clean drinking water.
Yeah.
There are very differed views on who produces it at what cost and who pays for what. So you took extreme heat. We were in Cairo for the World Urban Forum. If you go and see the tenements and apartments, all of them are using, and we see this in India too, the second-hand old air conditioners for cooling, which take 5 times more the amount of energy and are 7 times less efficient than the new ones. But they go into the second-hand market.
Yes, sure. That's a big issue.
And so we have to deal with that.
Yep.
So I'm just saying that you take every single thing, and all the attractive new possibilities become available to the elite. And all the old, you take it with computers, you take it with every electronic equipment. I can show you pictures in informal settlements where there's a mountain of old refrigerators and air conditioners and computers,
Right.
all of which are just going to guzzle energy and make it more dysfunctional. And then the poor get accused of that.
Yeah, indeed.
But then they're often stealing the energy that they don't get officially.
Yeah.
Could I think Sheela touches on a certain tension that I see happening now. We have the old cities, the more established cities in terms of build, infrastructure, or even governance mechanism. Whether or not the governments are functioning well is a different question, but at least there's institutions, there's infrastructure and so on. We have them, and these cities are shown to be quite problematic in not just in an environmental sense, but in terms of the social pressures that they are under. These cities would need to be recalibrated going forward. But this is also in competition with parts of the world where we have huge populations, I mean the majority of the world, where we have huge populations that still need to be catered for, that still need houses built, that still need energy, that still need food, that still need provisioning systems that can ensure that their everyday lives are functioning smoothly. We see a competition between these two. On the one hand, we've talked about the issue of them trying to copycat New York and London, knowing that this will not, whether or not they know, but we quite understand from science that this will not succeed. But what we touch upon less is that these two types of cities are in competition for the same resources and within the same carbon budget.
Yeah.
Something has to give. They cannot both go, that one set continues to grow and expand on an already massive footprint, and another part keeps cobbling to try to make sure that people live and have a livelihood. And so if you take, just from research, we understand now very clearly, if you build a new house today, and a new building today, and it's 30% more efficient than the one that you've demolished to build that, you need to use it for at least 80 years to offset the emissions that would have otherwise been the case if you had just renovated that building.
Yep.
This is just from an emissions perspective. You've not even yet gone into use of sand and the the political economy of it now, or cement and steel and all of those. So this is very elemental aspects which we're not discussing at the scale that is necessary. So we make an assumption that each city can take care of itself and grow and become powerful and succeed and shelter its people. It's not going to work.
Yeah.
It is simply not going to work if we keep with this zero-sum game of it. So, policies against or for new buildings with particular codes, against demolition, in terms of recycling of materials, all of these are useful, but it also needs policies that are very strict about dematerializing existing cities right now.
Yeah.
We cannot keep constructing the same kind of roads and parking structures and infrastructure that we had in the past. We cannot keep allowing things like provisioning for food, education, and all whatnot to be so intensified as speculative areas for investors. We cannot keep allowing an individualization of things that could be shared needs instead of building community libraries, tools libraries, third spaces, and common spaces. We really need to rethink not only what a city is and how it can bring joy and love and laughter to people, but really what systems underscore this need and how provisioning for them has been done so far. And this is not a part of that conversation.
Yeah.
We still have a situation where Delhi is competing with Shanghai, is competing with Cape Town, is competing with Mexico City in a zero-sum game where the only people that suffer are actually the people that live in these spaces.
Yeah. I would just like to, I think, wrap up by mentioning that there is some progress in terms of regulations.
Was that too dark, what I said?
Not at all. No, it's absolutely spot on. But I would like to mention the buildings breakthrough that's been announced recently, and the reports that come from the Global Alliance of Buildings and Construction that are specifically calling for sufficiency principles to be incorporated as part of, and that really speaks to what you're saying here, that we need to be using what we have already. We need to be really thinking about how we're going to be building and what we're using to build to meet those growing demands in a way that is creating that just transition, making sure that we are putting not just roofs over our heads, but ones that respond to the increasing climate crises that we're seeing. I think we're unfortunately at time, but you've given us so much food for thought, both Sheela and Lewis. Thank you so much. I hope you can be deep in the continuing negotiations and we can make some changes here. Thank you very much.